Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into part one of The Tangible Power of Shared Imagination by Phumlani Mathe. And we are looking at money. We are going to explore how money is, quite literally, the greatest collective fiction in human history. Now, you'll probably think the modern financial system was built by people who were entirely motivated by greed, right? That is the standard assumption. But the people who actually built the architecture of our global economy were not motivated by greed at all. They were motivated by the absolute paralyzing terror of God. Okay, let's dive right into this and see exactly what I mean.
Picture a human hand. It's holding a banknote. It could be any currency, it could be in any country. Now picture a second hand. A completely different country, a completely different currency. But it's the exact same gesture. 6 hands, 6 countries, 6 currencies. One gesture. It is the exact same offering made everywhere on Earth, thousands of times a second. You hand over a printed rectangle of cotton and ink, and in return, you receive physical, life-sustaining goods. Food, water, shelter. We take this transaction completely for granted. We accept it as if it were a fundamental law of nature, like gravity. But it isn't. The banking system that you and I live inside today is the direct, unbroken descendant of a 16th century theology. A theology where accumulating massive amounts of unspent money was the only way you could prove you weren't going to spend eternity in hell. To really understand how we got here, we first have to totally dismantle what you have been taught to believe about that paper in your hand. We have to look closely at the story of money.
So here is the standard mainstream textbook story. You've definitely heard this before. First, there was barter. People just exchanged goods directly. You have a pair of shoes, but you really want some potatoes. Your neighbor has potatoes, but he needs shoes. So you trade. Simple. But eventually, this barter system became inconvenient. It was clunky. So society sat down and rationally invented a neutral medium of exchange to solve the problem. First, we used gold, then silver. Then we used paper backed by that gold, and finally, we moved to electronic entries on a glowing screen. In this textbook story, money is just a rational, neutral tool. It is the logical, mathematically sound solution to a logistical problem. It feels clean. It feels inevitable. Almost too perfect, doesn't it? Well, that's exactly what the economics textbooks want you to think. But to understand why this incredibly convenient story even exists in the first place, we need a diagnostic tool. We need to go all the way back in time to the year 375 BCE. In his famous work, The Republic, the philosopher Plato imagined a very specific, terrifying scenario. He described a group of people who have been chained deep inside a dark cave since the day they were born. They are completely immobilized. Their heads are locked in place, and they are forced to stare at a blank stone wall. Now, behind them, there is a fire burning, and between that fire and the backs of the prisoners, other people are walking past carrying various objects, statues, tools, shapes. The light from the fire casts the shadows of those objects onto the wall that the prisoners are staring at. Let me explain why this is so absolutely crucial. Because these prisoners have never seen the fire and they have never seen the real objects, they genuinely believe those shadows are reality itself. They give the shadows names, they study the movements of the shadows, they build an entire worldview, an entire culture, and an entire society out of what are, in fact, nothing more than projections. Now, let's analyze this. Think of it like being born into a virtual reality headset that you can never take off. If the simulation is the only thing you ever experience, the simulation becomes your absolute truth. You will mistake a projection for reality. Let's apply this directly to our topic. That standard, highly rational story of money, the inevitable evolution from barter to coins to paper, that is simply the shadow on the cave wall. Think about your paycheck. Think about your mortgage or your rent. You are interacting with the shadow. What we are about to do in this explainer is break the chains. We are going to turn around and we are going to investigate the blinding light source that is actually casting that shadow.
The very first step in turning around is realizing that the shadow you've been looking at is a lie. Enter David Graeber. He was an incredibly prominent anthropologist who spent years exhaustively examining the historical and archaeological records of human civilization. He was looking for evidence. He wanted to find proof of that barter-to-money pipeline that every single economics textbook teaches as absolute fact. So what did he find? He found none. Absolutely zero. There is not a single documented example in all of human history of a society that used barter as its primary mode of daily internal exchange before inventing money. Graeber found that barter practically only ever happens between total strangers or between active enemies. It is not how neighbors interact. Let me analogize this. The barter story is essentially a just so story. It's a children's fairy tale that was invented backward. It was reverse engineered to make our present financial system feel natural, logical, and inevitable.
So if we apply Graeber's findings to actual history, we see what really existed thousands of years before the first coin was ever minted. Debt, social obligations, temple accounting, complex tribute systems. The obligation came first. The underlying power relationship, disguised as a fair exchange, was already there. Money was simply invented to formalize and track it. The shadow on the wall is completely backwards. Money did not make exchange possible. Money made pre-existing power relationships portable. Now think about the magnitude of that shift in perspective. If money is not a neutral mathematical tool for exchange, what exactly is it? It is a belief system. And like absolutely all belief systems, it was constructed by specific people in a specific historical era for very specific reasons. Understanding exactly who built it, why they built it, and how they enforced it across the globe doesn't magically make your money worthless tomorrow, but it does make you free. It frees you to see the machinery clearly. So let's start excavating the actual light source that casts the modern shadow. We need to travel to France. The year is 1536. In 1536, a French theologian named John Calvin published a massive work called the Institutes of the Christian Religion. One of his central foundational arguments in this book was the doctrine of double predestination. Let me explain this fully because it is the bedrock of everything that follows. Calvin argued that before God created anything at all, before the universe existed, and long before you were even born, God had already permanently determined who would spend eternity in heaven and who would burn for eternity in hell. That decision was locked in. Nothing you did in your lifetime could ever change this. Your good deeds? Totally irrelevant. Your charity? Pointless. Your ultimate fate was sealed before your very first breath. Let's analogize this to truly grasp the horror of it. Imagine a high-stakes, life-or-death lottery. The winning tickets and the losing tickets were all drawn and assigned before you were even born. You absolutely cannot change the result. But you have to spend your entire life desperately searching for subtle clues as to which ticket you might be holding. When you apply this theological doctrine to the people of 16th century Europe, you can see how it produced a devastating psychological wound. It created an entire society absolutely paralyzed by sheer existential anxiety. Because if your eternal fate is permanently sealed, how could you ever possibly know which side you were on? Calvin's eventual answer to this crushing anxiety is quite literally what built the modern world. He stated that worldly, material success is the primary evidence of God's favor. The logic was simple. The person whom God has already chosen for heaven tends to prosper on earth. Therefore, working tirelessly and accumulating wealth was no longer seen as a sin of greed. It became a frantic, desperate search for evidence of your own salvation. It was how you proved to yourself and your neighbors that you weren't damned. But here's the massive catch, the severe prohibition that changed history. You could not spend the wealth you accumulated. Spending your money on luxury or comfort demonstrated earthly appetite, and appetite was the defining behavior of the damned. It was the behavior of people who chose temporary earthly pleasure over eternal heavenly reward. So what happened? The wealth accumulated, and it sat there completely unspent. It pooled into massive reserves. It went directly into banks. Consequently, the most intensely Calvinist society in Europe, the Dutch Republic, rapidly became the wealthiest nation in Europe. Think about that the next time you hear a financial guru praise the unquestionable moral virtue of saving money. The Dutch Republic became a global financial superpower simply because its citizens were far too terrified of hell to spend what they earned. This is the very first link in the heavy chain of our modern economy. The absolute terror of hell produced permanent capital accumulation. Now, we are going to trace the physical chain of consequence. We're going to connect the links step by step from that theological terror to the world map we know today. Link 1, as we just saw, is Calvin's double predestination, creating massive anxiety. Link 2, that anxiety forces capital accumulation without spending, building massive Dutch banking wealth. Link 3 brings us to the year 1688, the Glorious Revolution. Protestant England and the Dutch Republic essentially merged their political and military power. Why? Because all that accumulated Dutch capital desperately needed physical safety from Catholic invasion, and England happened to have the Royal Navy. So the theological alliance becomes a financial one, and immense Dutch wealth physically transfers across the water to London. Link 4, the year 1694. The Bank of England is officially chartered. A private consortium of wealthy merchants lends £1.2 million to the English Parliament to fight a war with France. But in return for this loan, Parliament guarantees repayment not from the king's personal royal coffers, but from the tax revenues of the entire nation. This is the exact birth of national debt as a permanent structural institution. Why was this so incredibly radical? Because suddenly every single person in England was legally obligated to service a debt they had absolutely no say in creating. The bank starts issuing paper receipts for this gold, and those receipts begin to circulate as everyday money. Link 5, the debt loop. National debt fundamentally must be serviced with interest. Servicing that debt requires constant economic growth. Growth requires new, untapped markets, and new markets require aggressive military conquest. Link 6. The British Empire physically expands. It becomes, at its mechanical core, a giant debt service machine. It consumes India, it takes the Caribbean, it colonizes Australia, and finally Link 7, the Berlin Conference of 1884. European powers sit in a room in Germany and literally carve up the entire continent of Africa, drawing borders on a map without inviting a single African nation to the table. All of this violence, all of this empire, simply to service the mathematical architecture that was born directly from a 16th century theological wound.
So how did this highly specific theological and imperial construction eventually become accepted by everyone as just a natural law of economics? We can explain this perfectly through sociologists Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. They mapped out the 3 distinct stages of how societies construct reality. Stage 1 is externalization. This is where human anxiety, beliefs, and ideas are projected outward into the physical world to create physical institutions. In our case, the Calvinist anxiety over salvation was externalized to create banks, corporate charters, and colonial trading companies. Stage 2 is objectification. Within just a couple of generations, these institutions completely separate from the people who created them. They begin to confront the next generation as objective, naturally occurring facts. To a child born in London in 1750, the Bank of England didn't feel like a recent political invention. It felt like a mountain or a river. It had simply always been there. Stage 3 is internalization. This objective, manufactured world is fed back into our human consciousness during our childhood socialization. Let's analogize this to a simple school environment. Imagine a frustrated teacher invents a totally random rule to keep kids quiet and writes it in the class rulebook. By the very next school year, the new students are aggressively enforcing that exact rule upon each other, genuinely believing it is a natural fact of the universe. Now apply this globally. Children in every single colonized country on Earth, and you, sitting here right now, were taught from birth that this specific, imported, heavily violent financial system was simply a law of physics. The Calvinist wound was systematically internalized as the common sense of the world. To understand why a simple piece of printed paper actually holds life or death value for you today, we have to turn to the philosopher Immanuel Kant. In 1781, Kant published a monumental book called The Critique of Pure Reason. He explained a radical concept. The human mind does not passively observe reality like a video camera, it actively constructs reality. He separated the entire world into 2 very distinct categories. First is the noumenon. This is the thing as it actually exists in itself, completely independent of human observation. Kant argued the noumenon is ultimately unknowable. Second is the phenomenon. This is the thing exactly as it appears to us, after it has been filtered through the shared sensory and mental categories of the human mind. The phenomenon is literally the only thing we ever actually experience. Let's analogize this to make it concrete. Imagine a blind person feeling the bark of a tree, a bat bouncing echolocation off its branches, and a sighting human looking at its green leaves. They're all interacting with the exact same object, but they each experience a completely different custom-built version of it. The actual tree in itself, the noumenon, is unknowable to all of them. They only interact with their phenomenal construction of the tree. Now let's apply this directly to money. Reach into your wallet right now and pull out a bill. You are not experiencing its true intrinsic value. Nobody ever has. You are only experiencing the phenomenon of money. You are experiencing the agreed-upon social construction. If you strip away the shared mental agreement of 8 billion human beings, the noumenon is instantly exposed. And what is the noumenon? You are just holding a completely worthless piece of cotton and ink.
This brings us to the ultimate, devastating operational mechanism of our entire global economy, the Thomas theorem. Formulated in 1928 by the sociologist W.I. Thomas, it is a very brief, incredibly powerful statement. It says, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Let me explain exactly how powerful this is. Let's analogize it to a classic bank run. Imagine a local bank that is perfectly solvent, it is financially healthy, and everyone's money is perfectly safe. But a completely false rumor starts spreading around town that the bank is going broke. Suddenly, the depositors collectively define the bank as insolvent. They panic. They all run down to the street and violently demand to withdraw their funds at the exact same time. The bank doesn't have all the physical cash on hand for everyone at once, so the sheer volume of panic withdrawals drains the reserves, and the bank permanently collapses. The belief, even though it was totally false, produced the exact physical reality it predicted. Now apply the Thomas theorem to the Bank of England in 1694. The English Parliament passed a law that legally defined a worthless paper receipt as real money. Because of that legal definition, the merchants defined it as real and accepted it. Because the merchants accepted it, vast legal contracts were written in it. Because contracts were written in it, massive global wars were financed with it. The collective enforced definition successfully hallucinated an entire global economy into physical existence. And that precise hallucinated economy, born from a piece of paper, is the exact same one you logged into this morning.
But you have to ask yourself, how is this mass belief maintained so perfectly, day after day, across 8 billion people, without simply falling apart? We can explain this through the concept of manufactured consent. This was heavily developed by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman in 1988. They argued something very important. In modern societies, powerful institutions do not secure public compliance through physical force or violence alone. They secure it by carefully selecting, filtering, and framing the exact information that normal people receive. Let's analogize this to a newspaper editor. The editor does not actually have to print blatant lies to completely control the narrative of a city. They just shape what feels important and what feels impossible simply by choosing which stories run on the front page and which stories get buried on page 12. The omission is the control. Now apply this directly to our financial system. That clean, rational narrative that money is just a neutral, natural evolution from caveman barter, that is not an accident. That is the carefully selected story that is taught in every single economics classroom. It is validated by every central bank press release. It is confirmed by every financial journalist on television. The people teaching you this story are not necessarily lying to you maliciously. Most of them genuinely believe it themselves. They are just trying to do their jobs. But they are also prisoners. They're chained up right next to you inside Plato's cave.
Sometimes, though, a prisoner manages to escape the cave. They break the chains, they climb up into the blinding light source, they see the truth of the machinery, and they return to the darkness to tell the others. David Graeber was that escaped prisoner. He spent his entire career forensically demonstrating the truth. He proved that debt drastically precedes money. He proved that the standard economic textbook story is entirely false. He proved that the entire global financial system is just a highly constructed arrangement of power. And he published all of his findings. His book on debt sold millions of copies worldwide. Everyone read it. But look closely at what actually happened next. The university economics curriculum did not change. The Federal Reserve did not alter a single one of its forecasting models. The textbooks in the classrooms were not rewritten. Graeber passed away in 2020. The prisoner returned to the cave with the absolute truth about the shadows on the wall, and the system didn't even bother to fight him. It didn't have to. It simply absorbed the shock, completely ignored the light, kept printing the money, and methodically continued on. The illusion is just that incredibly resilient.
If the money system began as a theology, who gave you permission to believe in it?